this is the first one of the season. And before introducing Dr. Fishman, I just want to draw your attention to our next event, which is going to take place on Tuesday next week. We are going to screen the movie The Children of Abraham. And Ivan Sereznes was the head of the Jewish community in Sarajevo during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Will be here, and he's going to comment on the movie and answer questions. So it's on Tuesday at 10 o'clock. So if anybody hasn't signed up yet but wants to come, then after the lecture, please let me know. It's a great pleasure to have Mr. Joel Fishman presenting for us today. He's a historian by training, and he's a fellow of the JCPA, and he's also the book review editor of the Jewish Political Studies Review, our biannual scholarly journal. And Joel is going to speak on the topic, as you see on the board, Antonio Gramsci, Strategist of Social Upheaval. So it's a great pleasure, Joel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tomas. Well, if we're talking about Antonio Gramsci, who was one of the pioneers and founders of the Communist Party in Italy, we are speaking about one of the most important communist thinkers of the 20th century, and we're talking about political warfare. This is what we're really discussing. So I would like to tell you my approach. I'm going to go through my abstract, but I'm going to expand and give you the main concepts and background. Then we will go through PowerPoint and we'll broaden our knowledge, and we'll turn the pages. I've made there's a lot of information, and I wouldn't be able to convey it all in one go, so I made you a reading packet, and we'll turn the pages of the reading packet, and it's going to be short and to the point, and then afterwards we're going to show what the point is. After we've given you the history, we're going to find or discuss the expression of Gramsci's ideas in our political life today in such places as the United States, England, and Israel, so that we can also recognize the symptoms of the malady which he spread so successfully. But happily, I think there is a remedy, and President Reagan in his time found it, and in order to relate to the problem, one has to recognize it first. And so we'll just say that Antonio Gramsci was born in Ales, Sardinia in 1891 and died in Rome in 1937. He was a communist leader and Marxist theoretician. In May 22, he was sent to Moscow as the Italian representative at the Third International. He had a longer stay than expected because he fell ill. I think the reason was mental illness. But while he was there, he got married, and his wife was very, very close, and father-in-law was very close to the personal circle of Lenin, and he became close to Lenin. Now, this is a tremendously important fact, because if we're talking about things, if somebody were so close to the circle of the first generation revolutionary, it's Yichus van de Yichus. You know, if you were the son-in-law of Joseph Soloveitchik, you would also know what he thought. So, in a sense, so when Gramsci, yes, Lahavdil, right. But when Gramsci returned to Italy, he was incarcerated, and in 1928 he was thrown into jail, and he spent the rest of his life in jail, writing the notebooks from prison. And his sister-in-law, not his wife, his sister-in-law used to bring him reading materials according to his request, and smuggled out the notebooks to the Soviet embassy, which in turn put them in the bag and sent them to the Soviet Union. So we might also assume, if we knew how things worked, that sister-in-law was working, was an agent, and made sure that his legacy would be preserved. We can jump ahead, and in the late 1940s, his first works were published in Italian. In 1960, they were published in English, and when his works appeared, they had a delayed impact. But we could also say the 1960s was a time of upheaval, social upheaval, and anybody who lived through it in the United States would certainly know that firsthand. And Gramsci's ideas had a tremendous effect because they hit a willing and ready audience at absolutely the right moment. So timing in history is very important, and we'll come back to it. We should remember that his ideas are pure Lenin. They've not been pure, unadulterated. If you have ever had 100-year-old brandy, you know that with 100 years it gets mild and good, but what happened with this, it got stronger and more explosive. Now, the problem that bothered Gramsci and also Lenin, as they had expected, that during the First World War, the workers in Germany would rise up, and that Germany would be the first socialist country in the world. They didn't expect that Russia would be that. And the reason that the workers did not rise up was because they remained loyal to the Kaiser. And they continued to remain good citizens according to the norms of the society in which they lived. And similarly, there were uprisings in Munich and in other places after the First World War, and although there were active Spartacists and socialists who rose up, there was not any, and tremendous fighting on the streets in Germany in the early 20s. There was not a conflagration and a revolution which fell. Now, this represented a very serious failure for the Bolsheviks, and they had to give that very, very careful thought. And Gramsci set about solving this problem, and he said that the ruling classes in Germany, or in any other country, possessed both cultural and political hegemony. In other words, they were in charge of the school system, they dictated the values of good behavior in society, and they decided what type of behavior was acceptable. And because the ruling classes possessed the hegemony, it prevented the workers, or those who wanted to make revolution, from rising up and successfully changing the regime. So we could just take a quick look at our reading packet, and we have a definition of hegemony. This is on page 5, and this is the main concept of Gramsci. He had other concepts, but this is the main concept, and then we'll come back to it. And this is a summary written by Alan Bullock, a fine socialist British historian. In the writings of some 20th century Marxists, especially the Italian Gramsci, it is used to denote the predominance of one social class over others. For example, in the term bourgeois hegemony. The feature which this usage stresses is not only the political and economic control exercised by a dominant class, but its success in projecting its own particular way of seeing the world, human and social relationships, so that this is accepted as common sense and part of the natural order by those who are in fact subordinated to it. Okay, so from this it follows that revolution is seen not only as the transfer of political and economic power, but as the creation of an alternative hegemony through new forms of experience and consciousness. Now, we just say very simply that in order to take power, it is necessary to break the hegemony of the ruling classes. Now, this effectively means taking over civil society, mastering the educational system, mastering the press, enlisting the intellectuals, and also changing the value system so certain things that used to be respected would be no longer respected in the future. Among the first generation of communists, let's say, sexual modesty was thought of rather badly, and they wanted to show their break with traditional values by exercising sexual freedom. This was a very big thing in Germany and so on. So this is part of the package of breaking the hegemony of the ruling classes. And so then we'll go on to this further. He couldn't publish his writings, and so this contribution of Gramsci represented a departure in that he was able to find the vulnerable part of a Western society. What's interesting was that he was a Westerner, and to target it. There were many ideas of causing social decomposition by using other means. For example, the Germans send the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, and the revolutionaries in a seal train from Switzerland to St. Petersburg, and there they were able to make a revolution which would take Russia out of the First World War. The British were able, with early propaganda, to demoralize the German troops on the Western Front. And Lenin also called upon German workers to bring socialism by entering into mutiny into the powers that be. The ideas, let's say, of going behind the enemy's line and causing decomposition, those ideas had been around for a long time. What was new with Gramsci was that he found, according to the idea of Clausewitz, the strategic center, the sine qua non, the one target that if you would hit it, you would be able to really shake up a society. Now the rest of the theory was that if one could break the hegemony of the ruling classes, then it would be followed by a violent revolution, and the revolution would be something different, and so on. So we have also the weakness of his approach. On the one hand, one knows what to do up to a certain point, but on the second hand, one usually cannot get together the people who will make war and actually take power. So what we're experiencing in our time is the first part of the Gramsci strategy. But in order to do it, one would need to have the armed part, or the otzma, in order totally to destabilize a regime and take it over. And I'm going to jump ahead. The only person who was able to apply the strategy of Gramsci was President Reagan. Now, Reagan was able to destabilize Soviet society by challenging the hegemony of the Soviet hierarchy. He worked with Richard Casey and in cooperation with the Pope. And he had a number of measures which he put in place in combination. He went the whole way. He forbade bank loans to the Soviet Union. He got the Saudis to pour oil all over the market to lower the price of oil and to prevent the Soviets from getting foreign currency. They fomented unrest. They sent them printing presses to Poland and made it available, and we're paying the price. We fought the Russians in Afghanistan with the help of the Pakistanis, and the Taliban will be paying for that for a long, long time. And they also encouraged Jewish dissidents, and they prevented industrial espionage. Now, you need to have a great power to go to stage 2 of the strategy, but Reagan was willing to do it, and he was able to ante up, and he won. And it wasn't an accident. The person who worked out the plan and the strategy was Professor Richard Pipes. And Richard Pipes is the father of Daniel Pipes. And as you'll know, on page 20, this is from a book on victory, there's a description of National Security Council document 75, which was a clear break from the past. It was a decision on the American side to bring about regime change in Russia. And have no doubt that Richard Pipes knew what he was doing, and he knew where he was taking it from. It wasn't an accident of history that he used this means in order to shake the communist regime loose in Eastern Europe. So, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Marxist-Leninists have endeavored to take power and to destabilize the social, and political order in various countries such as the United States, Britain, and Israel. Their organization has been decentralized, but their message has been uniform. Journalists such as Melanie Phillips in England and thinkers such as John Fonte in the US have identified and described the recent resurgence of Gramscian thought, the latest revival and permutation of Gramsci's tactics should be a matter of concern, as well as the need to safeguard the freedom and health of civil society and democracy. If we're talking about hegemony, we're talking about the other side seeking to establish totalitarian conditions and totalitarian control over what is thought and what is published. That's what politically correct discourse is about, and that's what the French call la pensée unique. And the battle which is taking place, is the battle for civil society. How much belongs to Gramsci, how much belongs to Lenin, we don't know, but we could say that without his contribution, we would not be confronting the situation that we are now facing. But if we can recognize it, we can deal with it. Now I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation and expand on the information that I've given you, and then afterwards we'll take a quick look at the documents and open the discussion. So, this is Antonio Gramsci. This is what he looked like. And this is Tatiana, his sister-in-law, not his wife. His wife wasn't well, didn't leave the Soviet Union, but she visited him faithfully in prison and looked after his needs. I'd like to thank Thomas for his loyal help in presenting this PowerPoint presentation and also making this reading packet for us. I really appreciate it. Now, the prosecutor under Mussolini's fascist regime stated in 1928, "We must prevent this brain from functioning for 20 years. The fascists understood it. They knew who their enemy was. Now, pure Leninist thought, have no doubt, there are people who say that it was a more gentle form of communism and so on, and more humanitarian, that he had a humane component. Don't believe it. Now, the editor of the collected writings of Gramsci is Joseph Buttigieg. You will also find that I put it in his brief biography. And he runs a Gramsci website. And I said to him, Professor Buttigieg, tell me, how close were the two? You know, because Gramsci keeps on quoting Lenin, and it just keeps on coming up and coming up. So he said, he sent me an answer back by email. Lenin and Gramsci knew one another. Lenin admired Gramsci's work with the factory councils in Turin and thought of it as exemplary. Furthermore, the father of Gramsci's companion or wife was a strong Lenin supporter, and Gramsci's sister-in-law, Eugenia, worked for or with Krupskaya, Lenin's companion. So we also have a little reference. In my view, Gramsci wrote in 1931, Ilyich, that's Lenin, understood the need for a shift from the war of maneuver that had been applied victoriously in the East in 1917 to a war of position which was the only possibility in the West. Now, when he talked, a war of maneuver is when you can move armies around like the Germans did and when they beat the Russians, you know, during the battles of, the last battles of the First World War. And in the left and in the West, there was a war of position, which was a war that was fought in the trenches. Gramsci took this image and made an idea and made a parallel for political warfare. And he said that the future of political warfare will be a war of position. That's in society, it'll be the war of the trenches. In other words, there won't be quick movement, but the slow struggle for hegemony. So the war for position is the war which he was fighting. The other person who believed in the war of position was Trotsky, whom he disdained. And we'll also see that. So I have another quote. Omar Bradley said, amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. The strength of Gramsci was he was both a strategist, but as a thinker, he, with experience in the field, he knew where to make his investment and how to get the job done. In other words, he was one step ahead of the theoretical thinker, and that's probably why the prosecutor of Mussolini wanted to stop that reign for 20 years. He was a very dangerous man. Possessed practical experience and analytical abilities, an understanding of Western society. He did not suffer from the fault of the intellectuals. He dealt with the circumstances and the means. Edmund Burke used the term the circumstances and the means, and he found fault with the revolutionists in France because they had beautiful intellectual ideas, but they never figured out how to implement them. What Gramsci did is he devoted attention to the implementation, and let's say also his targeting was far more effective and dangerous. Yes, and his identification of the battlefront is different. And then he wrote in one of his notebooks, to fix one's mind on the military model is the mark of a fool. Politics hereto must have priority over its military aspect, and only politics creates the possibility for maneuver and movement. So this is political warfare. This is something, we'll get to it, but this is a dimension which I hope our country will begin to understand. So we have war of maneuver, is move armies. War of position is both the trenches and social and in society. And also he had a much longer time frame than most Westerners are used to thinking of. The time frame could be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever.
More than 50 years.
more than 15 minutes, as they would, or ruach. Now, there was a professor at Columbia University by the name of William Dugan, who wrote a book on strategic intuition, and he said with many of the great innovations, the existing knowledge was around, but the inventor takes it and makes something new. So we could say that Gramsci took a Clausewitz, he took a Lenin, he took his own understanding of society, and then made his analysis. So the examples that Dugan gave was Napoleon devised new ways of using light artillery. Henry Ford took the idea of the assembly line from a meatpacking plant. And Stephen Jobs was a guest of the Xerox Innovation Lab. And the Xerox had some inventions that they didn't know what to do with, particularly the screen that we know from the Mac. And Jobs walked out and then built the first personal computer. And so his ideas could be found also in Tocqueville. Now, I've given you the definition of hegemony. It's in your paper, so we don't have to go over that. So Gramsci's method can be applied by those who wish to do so. And we saw that Reagan had the guts and had the willingness and the desire, and with the knowledge of Richard Pipes, who knew communist strategy and tactics, was able to bust them. And so this is probably the only case where power was taken and the regime overthrown using Gramsci's methods. So we can be very thankful for that. And there's the problem of the intellectuals who don't think of the intermediate steps, and the Israeli weakness. The Israeli weakness is that, and I hope we're getting smarter, is that we don't think sufficiently in terms of political warfare. War for us, for quite a long time, meant moving tanks in open spaces. Particularly, our first setback was when we went into Lebanon in 1982. I hope I won't be controversial, but this seems to be a dimension that many people don't understand. And for example, not so long ago, a spokesman from the foreign ministry said, well, we only deal with sovereign countries, meaning we don't relate to the problems of NGOs or political warfare. But I think there is a slight change, and having felt the pain, we're beginning to become aware to this whole dimension where we will have to face reality. Now, what we're going to do is just quickly turn the pages on this packet, and I want to give you a lot of information, but I've given you the concepts. Here's a first-class biography of Gramsci, definition of hegemony, a second definition, and here we have something by a noted English journalist, Melanie Phillips, on page 7, describing the influence of Gramsci in England. Maybe Antonio Gramsci, the philosopher who became the iconic thinker of the 1960s, laid down the blueprint for precisely what has happened in Britain: the capture of all of society's institutions such as schools, universities, churches, the media, the legal profession, the police, and voluntary groups. This intellectual elite was persuaded to sing from the same subversive song sheet so that the moral beliefs of the majority would be replaced by the values of those on the margins of society, the perfect ambience in which the Muslim grievance culture could be fanned into the flames of extremism. At the core of those Western majority values lay the Mosaic Code, which first gave the world the concept of morality, self-discipline, and laws regulating behavior. Who then could be surprised that the Jews found themselves in the left's crosshairs? As it took aim at morality and self-restraint, it seized a golden opportunity to pulverize the very people who invented the rules in the first place. So this is 2006, Melanie Phillips. I won't comment on it, I mean, you can digest it. Now, the next thing on page 10 is a book called Doing Democracy, a manual for social change, for those who would like to bring about social change in America. My son was in Berkeley, and somebody was selling these books, and for $10 he bought it. It was written by Bill Moyer. And they have on page 11, which is the combined page which you could read later, the steps that one has to go through if one wants to bring social change. At your convenience, you can read it. It's pure Gramsci. Although Gramsci doesn't appear in the index or anywhere, it's been integrated so well into the American discourse that people even forget its source. The next thing is another op-ed from Melanie of 27th October, that's yesterday, against Soros and how Soros is trying to break down social values. Now, Melanie, you can read this too. I mean, I don't have to tell you about Soros, you are aware of it, but Melanie is interested in the method that he is using to break down, let's say, established values and to break down the bonds of society, and also to break down the moral bounds of society, which have the roots in the Jewish tradition or the Judeo-Christian tradition, what he's trying to do. So I'm giving it to you, and we should also appreciate the fact that Melanie knows exactly what he's doing. If she wrote about Gramsci, she understood. Another thing on page 14, we'll just skip, is an article by our friend David Bedeen, who said, why all of a sudden are we pushing the idea of a Jewish state? And he has a reference to initiative of Israel's Arabs in the Haifa Declaration, and that we have been forced, or we're being forced, openly or without recognizing it, to make our stand for the Jewish state. Otherwise, we might be caught in a situation where we might lose it. Now, I agree with David Bedeen, otherwise I wouldn't have put it in. But it's something that you can either take it or leave it. Time will tell. It's still an observation which is worthy of our attention. We have to decide. And we have on page 15, I have a manual for divestment, which was published in January 2006 by Al Jazeera, by a Palestinian activist, that's page 15, on how the Palestinians can organize their boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign against Israel, and the techniques that they should use. One of the things that he mentioned was the alliance between the Jewish community and the Christians as a target, which has to be a target for them. And also he mentions, I think, the changing of the consensus. This is Gramsci again. I don't know whether the guy ever heard of Gramsci, but this is the type of process that we are facing. Page 17 is, I used in a past lecture, propaganda of Bat Shalom, Reshet Nashim L'Kidum HaShalom, which is the same sort of thing within Israel, the idea of the far left to mobilize women they're considered to be a group as such, in order to bring shinui and shipur. This is also the same thing, changing the consensus. Next page is a delightful broadside from the ISM, International Solidarity Movement, and you can read that. And then Victory is on page 19 and 21 with the story of Reagan. So what I wanted to do, and I hope I did it, was to give you an overview of Gramsci, to tell you who Gramsci was, to give you an overview of his ideas, and also to show you how their tremendous influence, and that we can find them, we confront them wherever we look. But the first step in our case is to be able to recognize them. And let's say somebody like Gerald Steinberg, who deals with the NGOs, which are the activities of foreign governments that sponsor subversive movements in Israel, is the beginning of the antidote, because it is political warfare, and if we understand how the war is fought, we can also join this war and take on our enemies rather than act oblivious to what might be, to what is really a considerable threat.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Justice.
Thank you, Joel, for a marvelous presentation, beautifully organized. Did Gramsci have any particular attitude towards Jews?
Not known to me. Not known to me. It's a good question. I'll see if I can find out, and then if I can find out, I'll do. Oh, by the way, Fishman Ehrenstein was very happy that we're having this discussion.
I don't think Gramsci. Look, Jews were not an issue when he was put in jail.
Well, there were a lot of Jews amongst the circle of Trotsky and the early era of communism.
Yeah, but they were not identified. All people, they were de-Judaized. They were there as human beings. There was no such thing as particularist identities in the communist state. Look, in Italy, we speak under Mussolini, in the years of discrimination against the Jews, before 1938, when the fascist movement had a lot of Jewish adherents. Mussolini's own lover, Sarfati, was a Jewish woman at that time. Judaism wasn't an issue in Italy. I mean, that was not something which was a discourse.
He had mild disdain for Gramsci.
But not because he was a Jew.
Not necessarily, but he mild disdain for him. But it's not. You're right. I'll look for it.
Sure. My question was going to be, what was his problem with Trotsky? Not that we were spoken. Thank God.
Yeah, it's a good question. You see, Trotsky believed in the war of movement. That means perpetual revolution and going into direct confrontation with the powers that would be. Gramsci sided with Lenin, saying that that's not the way to go because that would only assure defeat. And so he was against Trotsky in that respect, and he produced this alternative, Torat Lechima. So he thought basically that Trotsky was wrong, which, if we look at subsequent history of the Communist Party, put him on the good side because the Stalinists, he agreed with the Stalinists, and that probably assured his preservation and continuity. He was on the right side. Yes, Rita.
Why are people oblivious to this if it's been around for so long? What would be the reason why people just don't seem to pay attention to all of this? I mean, we've been through the 60s, we've been through Colombia at the time and all of that. We know all of this. Why are people so totally, why does it have to be, why do we have to reinvent the wheel?
There are a number of answers, and I think we're always optimists and hoping for the best. I know, particularly, let's say, within the circle of Israeli leadership, they hoped, in the case of the Palestinians, that there would be a settlement any time, and once one made a settlement, there would be the end of the battle and anti-Semitism and so on. They thought that the struggle would be over. Now, if anybody, it's ignorance. The people don't know the doctrine of the other side. The other side, and Bernard Lewis wrote about it, believes in permanent conflict and permanent war. And there was an article of Bernard Lewis that appeared in 1954 comparing the attitude of Islam and communism. And with Islam, there's the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam. With the Soviet Union, there's the Soviet camp of peace and democracy, as opposed to the American camp of war and imperialism. So until, let's say, socialism and the Palestinians and our enemies, are also Leninists, wherever, take the view that there can't be peace until they've won ultimately. So we haven't taken the trouble to listen to our adversaries, who sometimes speak very, very clearly, and to register, to listen to, show, we haven't shown sufficient respect for our adversaries.
You mentioned in relation to some of the stuff in here that was pure Gramsci. I understood you to say that you weren't sure that the authors, actually knew that it was pure Gramsci.
That's right. Like in the case of Bill Moyer's doing Democracy, they might not have been aware, but let's say there are certain ideas which become so current, the change, the consensus. For example, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote about the revolution in France, said that if you were to look at the notebooks of grievances, the cahiers, the notebooks of grievances, that many of the ideas of the philosophers or the philosophes appeared in the writings of just common people. So his ideas and his methods have become so current that people forget where they ever came from.
So if I could just follow up on that.
Sure.
You know that it's Gramsci,
Sure.
and now we do.
Yes.
So can a knowledge of Gramsci's writings be used to counter?
I would say yes, and it's our obligation to understand, of course, it's our obligation to understand our enemies and how they work. And for example, this Dugin, who is a very interesting fellow from business school, said that Clausewitz wrote his treatise on war basically describing the methods of Napoleon. And after Napoleon's war, that's when people first developed an appreciation for what they began to call strategy. So studying how you're at, even in football games, a coach wants to know the tricks of the other side in order to beat him, or in chess, and so the answer is definitely yes. We have to understand what goes on in their head, or what, let's say, what's going on in the wider secular world, which is no longer doesn't see its North Star or its north in Judeo-Christian morality. Yes.
My apologies. I got caught in a previous engagement, so I missed the first bit. But I think we were discussing Gramsci in general. But I want to stress that while Gramsci clearly was applying himself to a revolutionary situation, he actually, as you I think said, was producing a methodology which could be applied by the right or the left, and you pointed out that Reagan had actually applied it. And it seems to me, one could, just as Melanie Phillips may get upset with Soros, someone on the left might get upset with Shuttle Adelson, who applies his wealth to his ideology by by subsidising the free newspaper in Israel, which is undoubtedly changing the cultural environment within which the Israeli public look at world affairs. Indeed, one might say that the Tea Party in the USA is really beginning to apply Gramsci's approach. One might say, for purposes of argument, that ever since the failure of the Oslo process, the right in Israel has created a cultural hegemony here through knowing Gramsci or not, applying the same methodologies. And the answer seems to me to why, if everybody knows about it, why haven't they dealt with it, is that, well, I think people haven't, whether they've authored Gramsci as the person behind all this, they understand the methodology. But nobody has yet, as far as I know, theoretically, produced an anti-Gramsci methodology. That is, I've not seen, and I don't know the rules of that subject very carefully, but just as it seems to me the left is floundering in Israel because it doesn't know how to cope with the present atmosphere here. It seems to me that in the world, those who oppose what Soros and others are doing haven't created a methodology for opposing it. And I think that's one of the tasks, it seems to me. As far as I know, nobody's put out a manual like Gramsci that says this is how you deal with Gramsci, whether you're coming from the right or the left. It so happens that Gramsci did write from the left perspective, most of it's been applied to the left, but it seems to me as a methodology, it is just as easily applied from a different perspective, and there are examples of it having been done, one of which you gave.
I agree with you, and in one of the I have no problem in citing Wikipedia, but in one of the Wikipedia articles it said that the evangelicals have been using some of his methods to to respond, and it's there's nothing wrong. I mean, one borrows a good strategy where one can find it and apply it, but one would not necessarily admit using it.
Okay, well, first of all, lots of thanks. I've been pushing for this for time, since time immemorial. And also explain later why I did so. A few remarks, first of all, before we get to the essence. As to Gramsci's biography, Mussolini did Gramsci a tremendous favor by putting him in jail. Because there is no doubt that Gramsci, let's say an independent thinker, would have been kicked out of the Communist Party if he hadn't been in jail. In fact, as far as I recall, Togliatti, who was the leader of the party and was in Moscow, blocked a letter from Gramsci to Stalin, which would undoubtedly, if he had passed it on, have meant the end of Gramsci in the Communist Party. So, from that point of view, that's the paradox of history. And obviously, Gramsci has not gotten the merit of his ideas, because what is written in Italian, like what is written nowadays in any non-English language, counts for very little. Gramsci in Italy can almost every town of any size has a Gramsci street. It's probably one of the most frequent names you will find. Of course, let's say you might say this Victor Emmanuel, this kind of people. So that, as far as Gramsci's biography is concerned. What I had expected that somebody else would say, I mean, you have said very clearly the two key ideas are hegemony, logistics. What somebody else, I thought here, would have said is that, of course, the logistics element was perfectly applied by Saul Alinsky, the ideological master of Clinton, and in fact, the guy did, and the guy, well, Clinton worked directly with of course, also Obama, but Clinton was a student of Alinsky. Alinsky was no longer, I think, alive when Obama came to university, but of course involved for the organization of Alinsky. So that likeness is, of course, very, very striking. You don't, as to Leslie's question, you don't really need a counter strategy to it, because the strategy is applicable to both sides. So why would you need a counter strategy? The combination of hegemony and logistics are crucial. Now, why was I so tremendously interested in a good lecture about Gramsci, and I'm glad that Peter is here? Because in my dealings with the two hate-mongering countries in Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden, I started to understand that that was as close to Gramsci as you could get to it. It didn't matter whether the opposition occasionally won an election in Sweden or in Norway, because the key positions in civil society, other than at the top of business, were always in the hands of the left. Practically all the papers in Norway are in their foreign policy. Even the so-called conservative paper Aftenposten are left-wing papers. Leaving aside a few marginal Christian papers, everybody is on the left. So the civil society, the church, to a very, very large, the official church, to a very, very large extent, is dominated by the left. The civil service, the diplomatic service, they all you find there that hegemony. Okay, one Norwegian recently said to me, yes, we're the last Stalinist country, which is of course not totally true, but you come up against a closed system there, which has perfectly, Norway particularly, has perfectly manipulated itself in a hegemonistic situation. Nobody cares from abroad about the country. Nobody cares about the language. Even the Swedes and Danes who can read the stuff don't look into the country. So you have a country which is self-contained, and as long as they can keep criticism out of the paper or drown it with 10 counter articles, the hegemony there is totally contained. And I wanted somebody who could explain this notion of hegemony, and how do you break it? To answer Leslie's question, you break it by logistics. Don't break it by a counter strategy. You find all the time tricks which embarrass the Norwegians. And that is the only way to break this hegemony, which is probably the strongest in Europe. Even in Sweden, it doesn't exist, because there are opposition papers in Sweden, not in the masses of the social democracy which controls everything there, but it's a much more open country. So I felt that it had once to be explained how the system works. Why cannot the Swedish opposition, which has ruled occasionally, and where we had friends, and where we today have friends in the Reinfeldt government, why could the opposition never break through this system? Because the diplomatic service is in the hands of social democrats. The state NGO is in the hands of the social democrats. The church is in the hand of the left. Most of the media are in the hand of the left. So you can never break through that system. And certainly the parties who are today the majority have not been able to break through that. So against that background, and I fully realize that Israeli government hasn't understood a bloody thing of it. They don't understand the first thing of hegemony, and that goes for all governments. Perhaps the only one today who understands it a little bit is Yalom, who has thought about the things but doesn't have the funds and the logistics to do anything about it. So I think it was extremely valuable what you did today, because it helped us to give a theoretical infrastructure for what we will have to achieve is to break the hegemony of the politically correct left of center, which are our main enemies in Europe. In most countries in Europe, let's be clear, the social democrats in Germany are not the enemies of Israel, and the social democrats in Italy aren't major enemies of Israel, but like they are in Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, what else do we have? Belgium, Switzerland. So we can go more or less around Spain. Just, so thanks a lot.
I just have one question. Joel, thank you very much for the very illuminating talk. What Leslie said struck me as raising a question. You talk about hegemony. What is it? Who has the hegemony in Israeli society? On the one hand, you have a left-wing elite, and who has views which are, we would call them, I don't know what you would call them, negative in terms of supporting Jewish state of Israel. On the other hand, as Leslie pointed out, you have a situation where the greatest share of the Israeli populace is opposed to those views and is even more strongly opposed to those views now than they were before. So where is the hegemony in Israeli society? Joel and Manfred can answer this.
Look, the hegemony, when I came to Israel in 1968, where the hegemony was totally clear. It was with Mapai. Mapai controlled everything, including a large part of the business sector. Today, that hegemony is not gone totally. It exists in the press. The exceptional role of Haaretz in this country as the intellectual paper, which of course is employs people which in other countries would be called, in our situation, traitors.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, without any hesitation. People who are allies of people who want to do genocidal attacks on Israel. But you find them in Yediot Achorot and a few of the other papers as well. So you find them certainly at the universities. The hegemony there is absolutely in the hands of the left, with the one exception perhaps of parts of Bar Ilan and the top of Bar Ilan. In the education, Yuli Tamir, of course, brought hegemony of the left into the schooling system again. So it is a mixed hegemony. You can say that, as people jokingly said about Jerusalem, if you hear an ambulance, it is either a Mapainik dying or a Likudnik being born. But you can say that that the hegemony of the left is declining, but it still is very strong and may become less and less important over the course of time, but both hegemonies exist next to each other.
I agree with Manfred. I think that there are gradual changes. As I was walking with Yurka to this building, we were walking up the bottom of the Hotel Chai, and we passed the house of somebody who used to be the chief editor of Haaretz. And I said to Rivka, this person used to be very important, and now nobody even hears his name anymore. I said, look what's happened. And that was an hour ago. So there are some changes, and the nature of Israeli society is changing. We are trying to, like Boogie alone said, and I'm sure that's our policy, אנחנו משתדלים לגדל את התותים. We want to cultivate our own garden and build the economy and build the society, and I think gradually as that happens, things will open up a little bit more. But as far, and I think that sometimes when I write for Makor Rishon, I was thinking, let's say 10 years ago, I could barely get a letter to the editor anywhere. And when I write articles, even if it's for a Zionist periodical, I can say that I can exercise freedom of speech, the kind of which I would never have in the United States. I can express any idea that I wish, and I mean, it's pretty heady stuff. So I think if we can stay at peace, the change for a better and more open society will proceed. Although I'm not a prophet.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.